The repeat offender, Frank Morris, is transferred under the cover of night to the most secure federal maximum security prison, Alcatraz, located on a small island in San Francisco Bay. Frank had escaped from previous prisons several times using his high intelligence, but this time the new warden is determined to prove that there's no escape from this stone fortress. On his very first day, during breakfast in the mess hall, Frank notices nonverbal signals from an inmate named Wolf, who seems to have taken an interest in him. There, he also meets a friendly man named Litmus and his small companion, a pet mouse. After the meal, the warden summons Frank to his office to personally take a look at the legendary escape artist. However, while enthusiastically praising all the benefits of life in this harsh prison, he doesn't even notice Frank quietly stealing a small nail clipper from his desk, as he keeps boasting that under his watch, not a single inmate has ever managed to escape. Back in his cell, Frank hides his loot inside a Bible. A bit later, in the shower, Wolf approaches him, clearly intending to make Frank his girlfriend. But Frank fights back and shoves a bar of soap into his mouth. After the shower, he's assigned to work in the prison library, where he'll be helping an African-American inmate named English Sort and deliver books to other prisoners. Talking with him, Frank learns that there's no way out of Alcatraz. Prisoners sent here are the most dangerous criminals, doomed to spend the rest of their lives behind bars with no hope of freedom. English himself was sentenced to 99 years for self-defense when two white men attacked him with a knife, and both ended up dead. Frank begins performing his duties, starting with delivering books on the lower tier. A little later, during yard time, he meets an artist named Chester Dalton, nicknamed Doc. Spotting a flower in one of his paintings, Frank asks about it, and Doc explains that it symbolizes his soul, thoughts, and feelings, things that cannot be locked behind bars and walls. It turns out that news of the shower incident had already spread throughout the prison, so Doc decided to warn his new friend that the humiliated and offended Wolf would be seeking revenge. Frank finds English sitting alone on the steps and joins him. The man commands respect among the African-American inmates, which is why he occupies the highest spot. Frank casually sits next to him, showing that he is not afraid, and starts a conversation about escape. English explains that everyone here is looking for a chance, but so far, no one has succeeded. Usually, in most prisons, there are 7 inmates per 1 guard, but here, it's 3 guards for every inmate. Each bar of the cell consists of 6 smaller rods packed into a steel tube filled with iron. The entire island is solid rock, and the cold water and strong currents leave an escapee no chance of reaching the opposite shore alive. Later, a guard offers Frank a paid job in the prison's carpentry workshop. For his work, he would earn a whole 15 cents an hour, better than nothing, so he eagerly agrees. During another yard break, Litmus plants the idea in Frank's mind that escape might actually be possible if they managed to get into the ventilation shaft above the cell block. Suddenly, Doc interrupts the conversation, warning Frank of the danger. At that moment, Wolf attacks his tormentor from behind, wielding a shank. Thanks to Doc, Frank blocks the strike and beats Wolf once again. The guards immediately stop the fight and transfer both participants to Block D, the darkest and most dreary area of the prison. Wolf, enraged, promises Frank that he will kill him once he gets out, after which they are locked in cramped solitary cells without light or furniture. Additionally, for disciplinary purposes, inmates in such cells were periodically doused with cold water from a hose. After some time, the thoroughly tormented Frank is returned to a regular cell, while Wolf, for his aggressive behavior, is sentenced to spend another 6 months in solitary confinement. Litmus is one of the first to congratulate Frank on his return, sending his little mouse with a note attached to its back. Soon, Frank gets a new cellmate, Charlie Butts, with whom he quickly forms a friendly bond. The others also warmly welcome the newcomer, and Litmus even playfully jokes with him, introducing himself as Al Capone. While all the inmates were out in the yard, the warden decides to walk through the cell blocks and takes a particular interest in the artist's cell. Unexpectedly, among the paintings, he found his own portrait, which Doc had been passionately working on recently. Seeing his face, the outraged warden immediately ordered his deputy to permanently forbid Doc from painting, leaving it up to him to come up with the reason. One of the guards immediately goes to the cell to seize the canvases and paints, and Doc falls into despair, as painting is all he has, his outlet and his purpose. Later, when everyone who worked in the carpentry shop arrived at their stations, Charlie noticed Doc's gloomy mood. Frank asked the overseer to keep an eye on his friend, but no one listened. Meanwhile, Doc slipped something into Frank's work jumpsuit. Then he requested a small axe, supposedly needed for his work, and in front of the guard's eyes, he chopped off his own fingers. Doc was immediately taken away, and the others returned to their tasks. Frank found a flower in his pocket, left for him by Doc as a farewell, and grew angry if the guard had listened to him. None of this would have happened. Later, English brings Frank some reading material and explains that Doc did it because the warden had forbidden him from painting. Soon after, Frank encounters the warden in the mess hall and calls him a touchy goat, to which the warden chooses not to react, simply remarking that Doc should have been more careful in choosing subjects for his canvases. At one of the tables, Frank finds an unexpectedly pleasant surprise: two of his friends from his previous prison, the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, who are now also serving time in Alcatraz for a failed escape attempt. Some time later, while sitting in his cell, Frank notices a cockroach that immediately scurries behind a ventilation grate. Remembering Litmus's words, he decides to turn off the light and try to chip away a bit of the concrete around it with his nail clipper, and unexpectedly, he succeeds. From that moment, he begins carefully devising his escape plan. During another yard break, Charlie tells Frank about his life. He was sent to Alcatraz for crossing a state border in a stolen car, thereby committing a federal crime. That same day, Charlie faced another shock. His wife came for a visit to inform him that his mother was dying and, according to the doctors, had no more than 2 months left. In tears, she begged her husband to call and say goodbye, but the guard abruptly cut off their conversation. Unable to stay in one place, Charlie tells Frank that if he decides to escape, he'll go with him. Later, sitting in the mess hall, Frank tells Charlie and the Anglin brothers that he has figured out a way to get out of the prison. The key is that the building is very old. Moisture eats away at the cement, and salt corrodes the metal. All they need to do is widen the hole around the ventilation grate and get into the service corridor, then make their way to the roof. They plan to leave at night to buy themselves time until morning, while leaving pre-made dummies in their beds. Clarence works in the barber shop and will get hair for the task, while John will snatch some raincoats and seam sealant from the sewing workshop, which they will later use to make an inflatable raft and life jackets. Everyone will think they floated toward San Francisco, while in reality they will head for the neighboring island. Although the chances of success are very slim, all the comrades support the plan. After this conversation, Frank began methodically chipping away at the wall, while his cellmate Charlie kept watch on the guards using a small mirror. After several days of such work, Frank realized that the nail clipper alone was too awkward to use effectively. To fix this, he steals a spoon from the mess hall, and then fuses it with part of the nail clipper right there in the cell. Shortly before this, Frank had learned the best way to do it from English, thereby informing him of his plans, and Litmus provided him with a dime to use for soldering. One of the guards smelled smoke and headed toward Frank's cell, but vigilant Charlie warned him in time, and Frank managed to hide the hole in the wall by covering it with an accordion. Luckily, the guard didn't notice the tool left on the floor and walked away, allowing Frank to continue his work. It soon turned out that the grate was fastened with 2 hooks, and to remove it, they would need to get hold of a couple of wedges. Frank found a suitable one in the workshop, but the problem was that the wedge was covered in metal and he wouldn't be able to sneak it past the metal detector unnoticed. Then the protagonist devises a cunning plan. He hides one wedge in the heel of his shoe, and when the detector emits a sharp beep, he openly shows the guard the second one, claiming he wants to use it for a new coat hanger. Naturally, the guard doesn't believe him and confiscates the item. Back in his cell, the protagonist finally breaks out the grate and continues widening the hole. Charlie and the Anglin brothers also start working in their cells. Additionally, each of them quietly begins making a dummy head, using paper, water, concrete dust, and hair from the barbershop. Under the pretense of a sudden urge to paint, Charlie orders a canvas and paints from the guards, later using the flesh-colored paint to help his comrades with the dummy heads. Additionally, at Frank's insistence, each of the men in their own cells makes a cardboard cover and paints a grate on it to disguise the hole in the wall, which grows larger day by day. When the hole had grown large enough, Frank, leaving a dummy head in his bed, went out to scout. He climbed through the pipes into the section above the cell block, and from there, hiding from the patrols, he reached the shaft leading to the roof. There, he faced a new problem. The grate was too high, and he couldn't even reach it by jumping. He had to return to his cell, just in time, as one of the guards noticed the suspiciously motionless head on the bed. During breakfast, Frank tells his comrades about his adventure and mentions that the shaft cannot be accessed without help. John says that since he finished with the vent ahead of the others, he'll go with Frank the next night. Additionally, he has managed to collect several raincoats from the sewing workshop, so they can now start constructing the raft. That night, John carries the raincoats from his cell upstairs and helps Frank inspect the ventilation grate. It seems quite sturdy. Beyond it, a metal hatch is visible. They could pry the bars apart with a pipe and then remove the cover. Frank also notices that there's electricity nearby, which they could use if they managed to get a motor and a drill. After performing in the music club, Frank stealthily steals a fan and successfully smuggles it past the guard in a suitcase with the accordion. Then, despite fearing solitary confinement, Litmus hands him an extension cord and a drill, which he had stolen from the workshop. That very night, John and Frank climb upstairs again to prepare the escape route for the others. John works on the raft, while Frank uses the pipe John provided to pry apart the bars of the grate, and then, with the homemade drill, opens the hatch. An unusual noise from the ventilation catches the guard's attention in the lower block, but he quickly loses interest and fails to find its source. Later, while watching a movie, Charlie confides in Frank that he's worried about inspections. The cardboard covering the hole keeps slipping, and sooner or later, they might be discovered. A few days later, during lunch in the mess hall, Frank tells his comrades that the escape will take place the coming Tuesday and that they need to be ready. That evening, Frank says goodbye to English, who brought him books, and shakes his hand. Shortly after, the warden unexpectedly comes to his cell for an inspection. Fortunately, he doesn't notice the cover, and Frank remains calm and composed, answering his silly questions with poise. 6 months had passed since Wolf was confined in Block D, and he was finally returned to a regular cell. On the way, the irate man didn't miss the chance to threaten Frank. To prevent him from taking action, Frank announces to everyone that they will escape tonight and sets a meeting at the top immediately after lights out. At the appointed time, Frank and the Anglin brothers leave their cells, leaving dummies in their beds, and make their way to the upper tier. Charlie, fearful of punishment, hesitates and takes a long time to join them. While he is deciding what to do, Frank's team reaches the roof and dashes to the edge of the building, then descends the drain pipe. Meanwhile, Charlie finally attempts the escape and climbs to the ventilation shaft. But it's too late. He cannot reach the grate and has no choice but to return to his cell. Meanwhile, Frank and the Anglin brothers climb over the fence and run to the shore, where they quickly inflate their makeshift raft and plunge into the cold water. At dawn, the guards notice that 3 inmates are missing and raise the alarm. Despite extensive searches, no trace of the escapees is found, and since their bodies were never recovered, the film's ending remains open. Did these 3 brave men manage to survive and taste freedom? And here, even more stories await you. Subscribe, because it's always interesting with us. See you soon!